one mention of the fact that his book was the first one that reviewed publicly for a mainstream audience the Israeli reservations, which effectively rejected the roadmap. Well, that's that. Then the next major event was the 2006 elections. The US basically promoted them, tried hard to get their own candidate elected, Abbas, but he lost. These were free elections, first ones in the Arab world, carefully monitored, recognized to be free and fair, but they had a flaw. The wrong side won. We have a concept of democracy which says it's okay as long as our candidates win. But if anything else happens, no, it's not democracy. So instantly, within days, the US and Israel instituted programs to punish the Palestinians severely for the crime of voting the wrong way in a free election. And Europe toddled along, as it usually does, also joining in the punishment. Well, that was 2006, and then starts the Gaza. The Gaza horror story had been awful enough for years, but kind of escalated then. In the next year, in the summer of 2007, the US instantly, right after the elections, also began a standard policy. If you don't like a government, let's organize a military coup. So they began to organize a military coup led by a Fatah strongman, Mohammed Dahlan. Hamas preempted the coup attempt. It was a fierce battle in Gaza, and Hamas essentially won the battle. That led to much more severe sanctions. I mean, it's bad enough to vote the wrong way in a free election. It's worse to block a military coup intended to overthrow the elected government. And then things got a lot worse. In the next summer, July 2008, Hamas and Israel reached a truce. Hamas lived up to the truce. Israel officially recognizes that during the truce, not a single Hamas rocket was fired. That's despite the fact that Israel didn't observe the truce. Israel did not. Part of the terms were that Israel would end the siege of Gaza, which is, of course, an act of war, and they didn't, and they had a reason. The reason is Gilad Shalit hadn't been released. Remember, he's a person, unlike the thousands in Israeli jails, many of them without charge. So therefore, they didn't accept it, but nevertheless, Hamas lived up to it. On November 4th, under the cover of the US election, Israel invaded Gaza on a completely phony pretext, killed half a dozen Hamas activists, and then rockets started firing. As usual, all the casualties were Palestinian, 100%. Late December, Hamas offered to renew the truce. Israel considered it, rejected it, decided instead to invade. That's Operation Cast Lead, December 27th. They're really shocking war crimes. I won't say anything about them. They're pretty well covered. There's a book by Norman Finkelstein, which is kind of a pretty definitive study of what happened. There's also a very revealing book by, which I don't think is, I'm sure it's been published here, by two Norwegian doctors, Mats Gilbert and Erik Fosse, who, amazing people. They were working in the main hospital, the Al-Shifa hospital, right through this whole horror story. And they just give a very gripping account. I mean, I couldn't put it down once I started reading it, which just goes kind of day by day, the horrors that were happening there. I certainly urge everyone to read it, even if you don't learn new facts. It gives you a picture that's, that the international reports don't quite convey. Well, meanwhile, the US blocked the ceasefire, usual action. This is after Obama had been elected, before he came into office. And he was asked, of course, if he had anything to say about these massive war crimes. And he had an answer. He said, there's only one president, and I'm not the president yet, so I can't say anything. He was saying things about everything else, but not that. Actually, his campaign did say something. They released a statement of his saying that if his daughters were under attack by rockets, he would do anything to stop them. He's referring to Israeli people in Sderot, a town nearby, not the ones who are being subjected to what Fosse and Gilbert call infanticide. And the term is accurate. If you read your book, you'll see why it was infanticide, miserable, violent infanticide, but they're unpeople, so Obama had nothing to say about them. The operation was very carefully calibrated so that it would end almost moments before Obama's inauguration, so then he could come up with the famous next statement that applies to everything. Let's not look backward, let's look forward. That's a wonderful slogan for the people who are holding the clubs on every topic, and Obama uses it all the time. Well, the next thing that happened is that Obama gave his first major speech on this topic. He, a couple days later, announced the appointment of George Mitchell as negotiator, which makes sense, sensible appointment, except for what he added. He added that Mitchell isn't going to have any powers, and he made that very clear. You had to took genius to miss it, but it was missed. He welcomed the Arab peace plan. There was an Arab peace plan which had been around, and the U.S. had rejected it. The Arab peace plan goes beyond the international consensus and calls for normalization of relations with Israel after a two-state settlement is established. And Obama said it's very good that the Arabs are doing this. They ought to now implement their plan by normalizing relations with Israel. He's literate, He knows perfectly well that that was not the plan. So did the journalists who pretended not to see what he was saying. He omitted totally the condition, namely two-state settlement, not a word about that, and just said, yeah, go ahead and normalize relations. That's a way of telling the world, I'm not going to do anything. And in fact, that continues on Israel-Palestine. He probably has the worst record of any president. I won't go on with the details. It continues. Last February came another major step. Obama vetoed a Security Council resolution. That's normal, dozens of them. But this one was particularly interesting and even got some press because Obama was vetoing a resolution which called for the implementation of official U.S. policy, namely stop the settlement expansion, which is of course criminal. So he vetoed it, and the State Department had to issue complicated explanations. But he just became a laughingstock at that point. By now, Obama has actually made a major achievement. He succeeded in reaching a level of unpopularity in the Arab world, which is even higher than Bush, and that takes some doing. Bush, I think, had about 9% support. I think Obama's down to about 5 or something. And he's mainly an object of ridicule with this continual humiliation of himself and, of course, of the country. Israel, they just ridicule with some reason. Meanwhile, settlements continue, and perfectly brazenly. In fact, after Obama's veto, Israel quite correctly took that to be, a green light saying, do everything you like. So they, in fact, they already knew it, but this finished it. In fact, it's utterly brazen. Just the last couple of days, Israel's announced a couple of thousand new housing units in what they call Givat Hamatos. That's a settlement, a new settlement, in between Bethlehem and Jerusalem, East Jerusalem. If you look at those two cities there, you can see one from the other. And Israel's been gradually surrounding Jerusalem with, expanded Jerusalem with illegal settlements, and this kind of closes the ring. It means that the people in Bethlehem can see Jerusalem, but if they want to get there, maybe they go through Cyprus or something like that. But, and that's done perfectly brazenly, read it in the newspaper, small column, and they know they can do whatever they like. At least, Obama will just genuflect, in fact, humiliate himself, as he's been doing pretty impressively. It's actually interesting to compare him with former presidents. So Bush #1 had a little self-respect. When Israel was brazenly insulting the United States by announcing a settlement expansion the day in which James Baker, patrician Secretary of State, showed up. The Bush administration sort of punished them. In fact, Baker was furious, and he told the Israeli government he'd not even talk to them anymore. And he said, here's the telephone number of the State Department. If you want to get in touch with us, call us up. Bush announced some sanctions, not very heavy ones, but sanctions, which were essentially called off by Clinton. Bush #2 went beyond when his administration ordered Israel not to sell advanced armaments to China, which they really want to do. They're a militarized state. It's a great market. They refused, and Bush administration not only compelled them not to do it, but went out of their way to humiliate them publicly. They would not allow Israeli officials to come to Washington. They insisted on an official apology. They said, we're not going to take that stuff from you guys. That's nothing like that with Obama. He just genuflects. And they know it. Well, that's what's happening here. Right now, with regard to the negotiations, the U.S. and Israel are delighted to have them go on, as long as they meet two preconditions, crucial preconditions. One is that they're under U.S. control. The U.S. has to control the whole region, so has to keep Europe out, everybody out, so they'll run the negotiations, which guarantees that they'll get nowhere. And the second precondition is that Israel must be permitted to continue to build settlements. I won't describe what this means, but if you look at a map, you can figure it out. Those are clear preconditions. No negotiations can continue until those are met. This is described differently in U.S. media and commentary. What's claimed is the Palestinians are imposing preconditions, namely that there be real negotiations and that Israel should stop building settlements. Well, you can look at it that way if you want, but a more accurate way, if you grant that Palestinians are people, is that it's the U.S. and Israel which are imposing strict preconditions designed to ensure that absolutely nothing will happen. Kind of in disgust over the pointlessness of this farcical process, the Palestinian Authority decided to go to the United Nations. Israel was actually deeply concerned about this. This was called a forthcoming tsunami. There was an interesting meeting of the Israeli oligarchs, a dozen or so people who pretty much own the place, a secret meeting which was naturally leaked. It was published in the Israeli Hebrew press. I don't think it appeared in English. But it was interesting. The oligarchs are pretty upset. They said if the Palestinians are recognized by the United Nations, we're going to go into what they called a program of what they called South Africanization. Longshoremen will stop loading ships. Countries will boycott our goods. Officials won't come here. We'll end up like South Africa. And they don't like that. After all, they own the place. They don't want it to go down the tube. So they urged Prime Minister Netanyahu essentially to accept the international consensus. That what they referred to explicitly was a particular version of it, the so-called Geneva Accord, informally negotiated between high-level Palestinian and Israelis. They were released in December 2003, I think, boycotted by Israel. The U.S. didn't pay any attention at all, accepted by the rest of the world as usual. Representatives from Europe came to applaud it and so on. It's kind of like the Taba close outcome, roughly in line with the international consensus. You can argue about this and that, but somewhere in that region. So they asked they urged Netanyahu to accept it, but he understands the United States very well, so he simply dismissed it. Then comes the UN episode. It's basically the US versus the world, as usual. Most of the world, almost the entire world, supports Palestinian statehood, in fact, has always recognized Palestine. U.S., of course, objects and says it will veto anything at the Security Council. Crucial question is what Europe will do. Will Europe have the integrity to take a mildly independent stance, or will it just bow before the master, as it usually does? And that's what Europe decided to do. It decided to go along with the master. To make it even more evident, they selected the utterly pathetic Tony Blair to deliver the message to the Palestinians saying, you guys are unpeople, forget it, go back to the US-run negotiations. The Palestinian Authority had the dignity to say that they're not even going to talk to Blair anymore correctly. But anyway, that essentially killed the UN initiative. Well, meanwhile, the West Bank is being broken up essentially in accord with what used to be called the Sharon Plan. Israel takes over everything behind the, they call it security wall, the annexation wall, which is important. It is taking over the Jordan Valley. And for those of you who want the details of that, there's a very good report that just came out from B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights group, which gives details in the Jordan Valley of sinking of wells, setting up regions where Palestinians are not allowed, and so on. And what you can see is just taking over the Jordan Valley. That imprisons what's left, and what's left is cantonized, salients running through it, 3 of them breaking it up into unviable units. Israel has finally understood what imperial powers long ago knew, that it's good to buy off the elites. So maybe not everybody should live like dogs, as Dayan said. Those in Ramallah, the elites, they should have nice restaurants, Shakespeare plays, that sort of thing, just like any third world country, any colony that you go to. And we'll keep them quiet, and then what happens elsewhere is they'll live like dogs, and of course Gaza will be destroyed. Well, that's where it stands now. What are the options? Here I think there's some misunderstanding, and it's worth clarifying. I think there are basically 2 options. One option is this will continue. The other option is a 2-state settlement. Now, when this is discussed, including by Palestinian intellectuals and even Palestinian officials and others, what they say is, well, there's another option, namely, we'll let Israel take over everything, and then we'll have an anti-apartheid struggle, civil rights struggle. But there isn't the slightest reason to think that it's ever going to happen. Israel doesn't want to take over everything. This is not like South Africa, where the apartheid government needed the black population. It's its workforce. They couldn't just cast them loose. Israel doesn't need the Palestinians, in fact, doesn't want them. Dayan's statement was correct. So they'll never take it all over. They'll continue to develop a very intricate program, very carefully organized program of infrastructure development, expansion, so on, take all the valuable resources, the valuable land, the nice suburbs of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, which are up in the hills on the West Bank, take over the Jordan Valley, and let the rest rot, except for Ramallah, where they can have restaurants. They'll never, so there won't be any anti-apartheid struggle. There won't be any demographic problem, a fancy name for too many non-Jews in a Jewish state. That won't happen. So that's just not an option, and there's no point thinking about it. If you're opposed to a 2-state settlement at this point, you're essentially telling the Palestinians, get lost, because it doesn't offer them anything. And I think that's worth thinking about. Shouldn't have illusions. Well, a final comment about this. I mean, there are lots of problems all over the world. A lot of them, it's very hard even to imagine a solution. Sort of trying to work out a solution to, say, Kashmir is pretty hard. But of all the problems in the world, this has got to be the easiest one to solve. There's an overwhelming international consensus. There has been pretty much for 35 years on a political settlement You know, you can argue about the details, but the basic form is very well known. There's one barrier the United States won't allow it. And the United States, most powerful state in the world, so what it says goes. But if U.S. rejectionism can shift, and it could, the situation would be quite different. In fact, there'd be nothing much to block a move towards a political settlement. Not a very pretty one, in my opinion. In fact, I don't like it at all. But of the immediate short-term options, the best one that I can think of, and maybe an opening towards further developments later, maybe better ones. But as far as I can see, those are the alternatives. And for us, I think that's kind of an optimistic conclusion, because it means that the future is actually in our hands if we decide to use the power we have. Thanks. Okay.
Okay, we have time now for some questions. There's no line over there, so we'll start over here.
Okay. Hello, Dr. Chomsky. It was a pleasure hearing you speak. My question is, you've clearly denounced US and Israeli aggression, or state-sponsored terrorism, as you'd call it, towards Palestine. However, you've expressed support for Hezbollah, and you were even greeted warmly by them in the year 2006. So my question is, how would you explain this double standard? And if this is not a double standard, then how would you justify that? Thank you.
I actually don't hear very well, especially through a mic, so I need a translator. But my translator isn't here either.
For some reason, it's very hard to understand up here on stage. Pardon me? These mics are bad too? Try it again, a little slower, maybe a little louder.
Okay. Well. Yeah, like I said, Dr. Chomsky, it was a pleasure hearing you speak. However, you've denounced US and Israeli aggression towards Palestine, which you call state-sponsored terrorism. However, in the year 2006, you were greeted warmly by Hezbollah on a visit to Lebanon. And you've also expressed your support towards Hezbollah. And during this visit in the year 2006, you endorsed those in Hezbollah. You allowed them to keep you expressed your support for them keeping their arms. And I believe in 2 months later, they attacked Israel. So how would you, if this is not a double standard, then how would you justify this?
I think, are you asking about Hezbollah? Yeah, so let's take Hezbollah. Hezbollah's, the U.S. doesn't want to admit it, Hezbollah is the major political force in Lebanon. There were elections in Lebanon, I think a year ago, and if you read Thomas Friedman, he practically wept with joy. He said he just loves free elections, makes his heart melt. And what was so great about this election was that Obama won over Ahmadinejad. Well, in fact, the Hezbollah-based coalition won about 54% of the votes, the same as Obama's victory in the last election. But the system in Lebanon is skewed by an old French imperial system that was imposed that grants confessional representation. And the Shiites were the poorest part of the population. They don't get anywhere near their proper representation. So even though the Hezbollah-based coalition handily won the election, they didn't have the majority of representatives. And Nasrallah, he said, accepted that without any comment. So they are, in fact, they and their allies are the major political force. What about their position on use of force? Well, here there's several questions that have to be asked. One is, does Lebanon have a right to defend itself from Israeli attacks? Actually, Israel's invaded 5 times in the last roughly 30 years. So does Lebanon have a right to defend itself? I mean, if they don't, okay, then the argument's over. Let's suppose they do have a right. Suppose they're people, not unpeople. Well, the Lebanese army can't defend them. For one thing, it's permeated by, it's totally infiltrated by Israel. You know, the U.S. has a heavy control over it. So they can't, and everyone knows they can't defend Lebanon. There's only one force that can defend Lebanon, namely Hezbollah. And they've done it pretty successfully. It's one of the reasons they're so hated in Israel and the United States. They finally drove, after years, they drove Israel out of its illegal occupation of southern Lebanon, year 2000. And when Israel attacked in 2006, they fought quite a surprising defensive battle, and Israel was pretty well bloodied. They had to pull out without achieving their objectives. And there's no other force that can do it. So, and while you say that Hezbollah attacked Israel, that's kind of a little misleading. Israel finally withdrew in the year 2000. In the following years, there was no Hezbollah provocation at all, even though Israel was constantly violating the border, kidnapping people in Lebanon, bringing them to Israel, putting them in prison, killing them sometimes. In fact, you read one of Israel's leading strategic analysts, Ze'ev Maoz. He wrote an article after the 2006 war, and the title was something like, border violation is border violation. He said, yeah, Hezbollah violated the border, but in fact we do it all the time. So we can't say anything about that. In U.S.-Israeli propaganda, it's called a Hezbollah attack. Okay, maybe they should have done it, maybe they shouldn't. In fact, when they did it, it was with the support of the majority of the population. They wanted to capture Israeli soldiers at the border and use them in a prisoner exchange. Well, there are lots of Lebanese and Palestinian prisoners in Israel, Lebanese too. So, okay, maybe right, maybe wrong, but it's a little, you can't call it aggression, especially when you look at it in the context. Now, you can like Hezbollah or not, that's a separate question. But I think these are the basic relevant facts about it.
Over here.
Hello. Thanks again for coming. Can you hear me in this? Is that okay? Thank you for coming to speak tonight. So my question for you is, so in a two-state solution, and there may not be an exact answer, but just in your opinion, in a two-state solution, what would Israel do with 500,000 settlers? And that is, should they be removed, or what exactly is your take on that?
In your opinion, what? What came after that?
You got the important part.
Can you hear me now? Is that better? Okay. In a two-state solution, what would Israel do with 500,000 settlers?
In a two-state solution, what would Israel do with the
settlers?
settlers?
Let me just go back and say one more word about the preceding question, because there's an interesting fact about it, which is known to people who read the Hebrew press, but isn't acknowledged here. One of the main prisoner that Hezbollah wanted released is Samir Kuntar, who's a little bit like Omer Khader. I think he was a 15-year-old boy, I think, who was Lebanese, who was accused of a really brutal murder, killing a 2-year-old Israeli girl. Well, maybe that's right, or maybe not. His Israeli interrogator, the guy who interrogated him, you know, from the Shin Bet, says he's innocent. He didn't do it, you know, he's convinced, so we can put that aside. What would happen to the settlers? Well, I know what my feeling is, and what the two sides would decide is up to them. But my feeling is that Israel should offer to evacuate settlers back to Israel. It should give them inducements to leave their government-subsidized homes, because remember, they're heavily subsidized to move into the occupied territories. It would say, okay, leave your subsidized homes in the West Bank, and we'll give you subsidized homes in Israel. My guess is that probably 95% of the settlers would leave. If there are a few Orthodox Jews from Brooklyn who want to hang on to every rock, they should be. I think they should be allowed to stay in a Palestinian state. But that's my opinion. Yeah.
Thank you.
Over here. Over here, please.
Mr. Chomsky, you mentioned that negotiations under U.S. control would have specific preconditions, according to some evidence on your part. However, at the United Nations just a few weeks ago, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stood up and called on direct negotiations here in New York without preconditions. Mahmoud Abbas said no. What is your comment on that?
Because exactly what I said. Netanyahu imposed two crucial conditions. The negotiations have to be under US control. That means the world's leading rejectionist power will have to be the negotiator. Okay, that kills him right away. And crucially, he insisted on a very important precondition. Israel must be allowed to increase its illegal settlements, which are tearing the place to shreds. And of course, everyone, including him, knows that as long as the negotiations go on under US control, they'll go on forever. And meanwhile, Israel will take what it wants. So yeah, he stood up and he announced those crucial preconditions, which in the US are interpreted differently. Because remember, we don't consider the Palestinians to be people, they're unpeople. So therefore, we interpret it, you read the press here, as Palestinian preconditions. That's not what it is. He's imposing... It's really, quite straightforward. The two issues are, should the US run them, which guarantees that nothing will happen, and should Israel be permitted to continue its illegal settlement programs, which are indisputably illegal, which will essentially give it what it wants. Those are the preconditions.
This last question was an excellent model for how to ask your questions slowly and enunciate.
Yeah, actually, if they don't come too close to the mic, I think it's better.
And it may be better not to come too close to the mic.
Yeah.
Okay. It's going to be a tough act to follow. Okay. Good evening, Professor Chomsky. Can you explain what is meant by a binational state? And if the two-state settlement that you talked about, the one based on the international consensus, if that goes through, would that be a precursor to an ultimate binational state, or would that be an ultimate end in and of itself?
Afraid I didn't get it.
No? I think you heard it.
Oh, a binational state.
Whether the plan you're talking about is then a precursor to that.
To a binational. Well, I mean, I've been in favor of a binational state all my life. Actually, not even in favor of that. I don't see any particular reason for worshiping the imperial imposed borders. When I happened to live in Israel with my wife about 60 years ago, and we were students, backpacking around and so on. We happened to cross the Lebanese border. It wasn't marked, there's no mark. It's just the Galilee, arbitrarily broken in two by Britain and France for their own imperial reasons. Why should, maybe you have to accept them. Why should we regard them as holy? So short of that, and it's not a small point, if you do worship the borders, then I think a binational state is a much better solution. Back in the 1940s, I was a Zionist youth leader, but opposed to a Jewish state, in favor of a binational state based on Arab-Jewish working-class cooperation. I still think that's the best idea, but I only know of one way to get there at all that's even possible, and that's in stages. If there's another way, I'd like to hear about it. But I mean, I hear a lot of people talk about